Hey everyone, welcome back to A Climber's Mind. The last episode was my conversation with Mike Boyd, and I really wanted that conversation because it moved away from the usual training and performance chat into something much broader. We spoke about becoming a dad, identity, pressure, work, content creation, mental health, and how climbing fits into a life that's challenging and changing constantly. That conversation's brought up something I want to reflect on a little bit, because so much of the climbing improvement conversation gets reduced to training. Most of the time, we're talking about finger strength, power, board climbing, hangboarding, endurance training, or even just managing your training sessions. But I think there's a really important conversation to have around where physical training actually fits into the bigger picture. Now, I want to be very clear from the start. I'm not anti-training. This is not my message. I think many people have misinterpreted some of the things that I've said as being me against physical training, or thinking that strength doesn't matter, or that tactics and mindset are somewhat a replacement for physical preparation. That's absolutely not what I mean. Physical training matters a lot. If you want to peak physically, if you want to reach your absolute limit of what your body is capable of doing, then physical training is crucial. At some point, you do have to raise the ceiling. You do have to get stronger. You do have to improve your fingers, your pulling power, your body tension, your power endurance, your flexibility, your robustness, or whatever real physical limiter you have present. There are situations where the moves are simply too hard. There are situations where you're not physically prepared enough for the demands of the route. And in those cases, mindset alone is not going to save you. Better tactics alone are not going to get you strong enough to do a move that is currently beyond your capacity. So the message is not physical training doesn't matter. The message is physical training needs to be understood in context. Where I think climbers often go wrong is assuming that physical training is always the answer. A lot of climbers feel they need to get stronger, but when you zoom out, they're actually leaving so much performance off the table. They're not resting properly. They're not managing the sessions well. They're trying hard, but not trying well. They're rushing attempts. They're not route reading. They're not visualizing. They're not remembering detail. They're not managing pressure. They're not choosing the right objectives. They're not structuring the project in well. And they're not giving themselves enough time to learn. They're comparing themselves to others. They're emotionally attached to the outcome. They're stressed, under-recovered, overwhelmed, and trying to solve all that by adding more physical load. And that's where I think the problem comes in. Because if your life is already full, your sleep is poor, your stress is high, your sessions are chaotic, and your decision making is poor, then adding yet another training block might not be the fastest or healthiest way to improve. It might help a little bit, but it might also make you feel more tired. It might make your climbing feel heavier. It might reinforce the belief that you're not doing enough, when actually the issue is that you're not getting enough out of what you're already doing. Now, I write training plans for a living, and I can tell you for a fact that the majority of the people that come to me for training, regardless of the level they're climbing at, most of the time what we're trying to do is iron out the foundations. That could be managing their lifestyle, their psychology, their approach, their execution framework, or even simply learning to relax a little bit more. Most climbers don't need to do more first. They need to understand more first. They need to understand what is actually limiting them. That might be physical, but it might not be. And that's why diagnosis comes first. Not training comes first. Not mindset comes first. Not tactics come first. Diagnosis comes first. For one climber, the correct answer might be a dedicated physical training plan. They might genuinely need to be stronger. They might need to improve their ability to pull hard, or they might need to improve their finger strength, or they might need to improve their endurance. They might need to raise their physical ceiling before they can realistically expect to break through. But for another climber, the answer might not be that. It could be completely different. They might already be strong enough to do the climb they want to do, but they are failing because they are overgripping, rushing, getting scared, climbing inefficiently, choosing poor tactics, or never giving themselves enough time to actually learn the climb. And for another climber, the main limiter could even be their lifestyle, especially if you've got kids or a really demanding job. That might be leading you to carry a lot of stress. Perhaps you've only got 2 windows a week to climb. And in that situation, the goal probably isn't to build a plan that looks like something a full-time athlete would do. The goal is to build something that actually fits, something they can recover from, something that makes the most out of their limited time, something that improves the quality of their climbing rather than just increasing the quantity of their training. And this is what I found with the conversation that I had with Mike, because becoming a dad is such a clear example of life changing. It forces you to reassess what climbing is, what training is, what progress is, what identity is. You can't just pretend you have the same time, the same energy, the same recovery, the same emotional bandwidth, and the same priorities as before. Something has changed. And that doesn't mean climbing has to become less meaningful. It doesn't mean you can't improve, but it does mean the approach has to become more intelligent. And I think that applies to so many climbers, not just new parents, anyone with a demanding job, anyone with stress, anyone with anxiety, anyone with a complicated relationship with climbing, anyone that feels they are constantly behind, anyone who's trying to fit high-level performance into a real life. You cannot separate training from the person doing the training. You cannot separate performance from lifestyle. You cannot separate climbing from identity, emotion, work, sleep, stress, relationships, and recovery. This is the bigger picture I'm interested in. So when I talk about tactics, technique, fear, identity, pressure, comparison, emotional regulation, and lifestyle, I'm not saying physical training is irrelevant. I'm saying physical training is one part of the puzzle. And for a lot of climbers, it's not the piece that is currently blocking the most progress. That's the distinction. So what I'm saying is that physical training is not the bottleneck. I think this is where some people may mishear the message. They hear me saying, you probably don't need more training right now, and they interpret that as, training doesn't matter. But those are completely different statements. Training does matter, but more training is not always the best answer. And sometimes it's actually a way of avoiding the real work, because training is measurable, it's controllable, it feels productive. You can write it down, you can track it, you can say, I did my session. But improving your tactics, your decision making, your focus, your fear response, your emotional regulation, your ability to reflect honestly, that stuff is harder to measure. It's less clean. It's less obvious. But for a lot of climbers, it's where the biggest gains come from. A climber might say, I need better power endurance. But then you watch them on a route and they're climbing too fast, clipping badly, missing rests, overgripping, breathing poorly, and panicking as soon as they get pumped. So do they need more power endurance? Maybe it might help, but they might also be wasting the power endurance they already have. Another climber might say, I need stronger fingers. But then every time they try a boulder, they rush, forget their feet, don't rest long enough, change beta too quickly, and never give themselves enough time to actually refine the movement. So do they need stronger fingers? Perhaps. But they might also need to learn how to try better. Another climber might say, I need to train more. but they're sleeping badly, stressed at work, anxious, underfueled, and already struggling to recover from the climbing they're already doing. So do they need more? Definitely not. They might need less noise, more clarity, better structure, better recovery, better decision making. This is why my coaching philosophy always comes back to diagnosis. The question is not, what's the best training plan? The question is, what is the actual limiter? What is the bottleneck? Because the best training plan for the wrong problem is still the wrong plan. You can have a beautifully structured fingerboard cycle, but if the real issue is fear, tactics, or poor projecting structure, then you might get stronger but still not climb any better. You can have an amazing strength phase, but if your lifestyle cannot support it, you might just end up tired, frustrated, or injured. And equally, you can spend ages talking about mindset, but if the problem is genuinely the holds are too small and you don't have the physical capacity yet, then you probably need to train. So it's not one or the other. It's not physical training versus mindset. It's not strength versus technique. It's not tactics versus power. It's about sequencing. What does the climber need now? What's the thing that unlocks the next level of progress? What is the right intervention at the right time? And I think this leads quite nicely into the next episode with Conrad Caddy. Because Conrad is someone who has climbed at a very high level and has thought deeply about the process of improvement. I'm really looking forward to getting into that conversation because I think it will let us explore the questions from another angle. What does it actually take to get better? How much is physical? How much is technical? How much is tactical? How much is psychological? How do you bring all these pieces together? And how do you make the process sustainable enough that people can actually keep improving over the long term? Because that's the thing I'm most interested in. Not just short-term performance, not just getting stronger for the sake of getting stronger, but building climbers who understand themselves deeply, climbers who make better decisions, climbers who can train when training is needed, but also know when the answer is something else. So I suppose the main point of this episode is this. Physical training is absolutely critical if you want to peak. But most climbers aren't anywhere near their peak. And I believe that the only climbers that can get full value out of physical training are the kinds of climbers that have already optimized their tactics, technique, mindset, lifestyle, and recovery, and the only thing left is more strength and power. Most climbers are leaving a huge amount of performance on the table elsewhere. And often, these areas provide faster progress, healthier progress, more sustainable progress, because they allow you to access the ability you already have. So no, I'm not anti-training, I'm anti-blind training. I'm anti-training as an automatic answer. I'm anti-adding load without understanding the problem. But I'm very much in favour of physical training when it's used well, when it's specific, when it's targeted, when it fits the person, when it fits the phase, when it fits the goal, when it addresses the real limitation. That's the message. Diagnosis first, then the right intervention. And sometimes that intervention is physical training. But sometimes it's tactics, sometimes it's technique, sometimes it's mindset, sometimes it's lifestyle, sometimes it's rest. Sometimes it's simply learning how to try with more clarity. But the answer has come from understanding the climber in front of you, not from blindly assuming that more is always better. That's what I wanted to reflect on after the conversation with Mike. It's something I'm excited to explore in the next episode with Conrad Caddy. As always, if this resonates, I'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you know someone who feels like they're constantly trying to train harder, but is not actually climbing better, maybe send this episode their way. Because sometimes the next step isn't doing more. Sometimes the next step is seeing the problem more clearly.